Dakota Territory, November 14, 1886. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, hanging low and heavy over the scrubland near purely fictitious settlement of Bitter Creek. The wind here didn't just blow. It hunted. It sought out the gaps in chinking, the cracks in window frames, and the thin spots in wool coats. On a rise overlooking the settlement, a man named Elias Thorne was doing something that made the locals stop their wagons and stare. Elias was a quiet man, a former boiler mechanic for the Union Pacific Railroad who had come west with a limp and a head full of equations. While his neighbors, sturdy Swedes and Germans like Jebediah Miller, were frantically chopping cordwood and stacking hay bales against their foundations, Elias was scavenging trash. Specifically, he was collecting glass bottles, whiskey bottles, tonic vials, wine carafes, anything clear and intact. He had bartered fresh eggs for empty glass at the saloon in town, hauling them back by the crate load. Building yourself a tavern, Thorne. Jebediah Miller shouted from the road, leaning on his axe handle. A few other men chuckled, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Going to drink your way through the winter? Elias didn't look up. He was kneeling in the mud, his hands stained pitch black. He was taking a hammer to a pile of charred wood, pulverizing charcoal into a fine silty dust. Beside him sat a barrel of river water. "It's not for drinking, Jeb," Elias said, his voice flat. He poured the charcoal dust into the water, stirring it into a thick, black slurry, a dark, viscous soup that looked more like industrial runoff than anything useful. He then took a funnel and began pouring the black sludge into the clear glass bottles, one by one, filling them to the neck before sealing them tight with melted beeswax. Jebediah shook his head, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. Voice cracked, he muttered to his companion. "That glass is gonna shatter the second the freeze hits. He'll have a wall of broken shards and black ice. He'll freeze to death before Christmas." The neighbors laughed. It was a nervous laughter, the kind men used to ward off the fear of the coming winter. They saw a fool playing with trash. They didn't see what Elias saw, they saw garbage. Elias saw a thermal battery. They didn't know it yet, but that crazy wall of black bottles was the only thing standing between Elias Thorne and the deadliest winter the territory had ever seen. To understand why Elias was right and everyone else was wrong, you have to understand where he came from. Elias wasn't a farmer. He was an engineer who had spent 10 years keeping steam engines from exploding. He understood thermodynamics not as a theory, but as a physical force that could tear steel apart or keep a train moving at 60 miles per hour. He knew something the farmers didn't: specific heat capacity. Most frontier cabins were built on a simple principle: insulation. You build thick logs to keep the cold out and the heat in, but wood has a low thermal mass. It heats up fast and cools down fast. Once your fire dies, your cabin dies. Elias knew that water is different. Water is a miracle substance. It has a specific heat capacity of 4.186 joules per gram degree Celsius. That is over 4 times the heat holding capacity of air, and nearly 5 times that of dry soil or brick. Water is stubborn. It hates to change temperature. It takes a massive amount of energy to heat it up, but once it's hot, it holds on to that energy like a miser with gold. But clear water wasn't enough. Clear water lets sunlight pass right through it. Elias needed a black body absorber. By mixing crushed charcoal dust into the water, he created a suspension that would catch 95% of the solar radiation hitting it. The sun would strike the south-facing wall, pass through the clear glass, and hit the black particles suspended in the liquid. Those particles would heat up, transferring their energy to the water. He wasn't building a wall. He was building a radiator that ran on sunlight. If you enjoy uncovering the lost survival technologies of the American frontier, make sure to subscribe. We dig through the archives to find the engineering secrets that history forgot. By December 20th, the laughter had stopped. The winter of 1886 to 1887 is known to history as the Big Dayup. It wasn't just a winter, it was an atmospheric collapse. A series of blizzards swept down from the Canadian Shield, burying the plains in drifts that reached the rooftops. On January 9th, the temperature at Bitter Creek plummeted to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a cold that defies description. At minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, moisture freezes instantly. The fluid in your eyes begins to crystallize if you don't blink often enough. Wood becomes brittle, snapping like glass. Down in the valley, Jebediah Miller's cabin was a tomb. Jeb was a strong man, a capable man. He had 3 cords of oak stacked in a cast-iron stove that was red hot, but it wasn't enough. The physics of the cold were winning. Inside Jeb's cabin, the temperature hovered at 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The family was huddled under 4 layers of quilts, shivering violently. The problem was the draft. To feed the fire that hot, the stove was sucking massive amounts of air from the room, the stack effect. This created a vacuum that pulled freezing air in through every microscopic crack in the logs. The more wood Jeb burned, the more cold air he sucked into the house. It was a losing battle. The water in the bucket near the door had frozen solid 3 days ago. Frost was creeping up the inside of the walls, a white mold of ice. "We need more wood," Jeb's wife whispered, her lips blue. "I can't go out there, Mary," Jeb said, looking at the door. "The wind is blowing 50 miles an hour. If I get lost in the whiteout." He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew the stories. Men found frozen solid 10 feet from their own front doors. They sat in the dark, listening to the wind scream, waiting for the fire to burn down, knowing that when it did, the real cold would come. 3 miles away, up on the exposed ridge, the wind was hitting Elias Thorne's cabin with the force of a freight train. By all conventional logic, Elias should have been the first to die. His cabin was smaller, his wood pile was half the size of Jeb's, and he had that ridiculous wall of glass bottles facing south. But inside Elias's cabin, it was 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Elias was sitting in a rocking chair, reading a tattered copy of a mechanic's manual. He wasn't wearing a coat, he was in his shirt sleeves. A small pot of coffee was steaming gently, not on the stove, but sitting on a stone shelf built into the south wall. The wall looked like a honeycomb of alien biology. The bottoms of the bottles, facing inward, were warm to the touch, not hot warm, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's what was happening while the storm raged. During the short daylight hours, even through the thin cloud cover and the swirling snow, the sun had bombarded the south wall. The clear glass ends of the bottles, protruding just an inch past the exterior clay, acted as lenses. The water temperature inside the glass rose steadily throughout the day, peaking just as the sun went down. Now it was midnight. The storm was at its zenith. Outside, it was nearly 40 below zero, but the thermal battery was discharging. Heat moves from high concentration to low concentration. Because water releases heat slowly, this wasn't a blast of hot air. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse of warmth that would last for 12 to 14 hours. Elias didn't need a roaring fire to combat the draft. He just needed a small blaze to cook his food. The wall was heating the air mass of the room silently, passively, and for free. He walked over to the wall and placed his hand against the glass. It felt like holding a warm mug of tea. He looked out the window at the black void where the settlement lay. He wondered if the neighbors were still laughing. The storm broke 3 days later. The silence that followed was deafening. The snow was packed so hard a man could walk on top of it without sinking. Jebediah Miller emerged from his cabin like a man crawling out of a grave. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. They had burned their furniture. They had burned the extra floorboards from the loft. They were alive, but barely. Smoke was rising from the chimneys in the valley, thin and white, not the desperate black smoke of a furnace running at full bore. Jeb grabbed his snowshoes. He told himself he was going to check if Elias was dead. The drifts were 10 feet high in places. When Jeb finally reached the cabin, he stopped. The south wall was ugly. The snow around the base of the wall had melted back a good 6 inches, exposing the brown earth. Jeb knocked on the door. The wood didn't sound frozen. It sounded solid. The door opened. The first thing that hit Jeb wasn't Elias. It was the smell. It didn't smell like damp wool and sickness. It smelled like dry pine and coffee. Then came the heat. It washed over Jeb's face like a physical wave. Elias stood there holding a mug. He looked well-fed. He looked rested. "Jeb," Elias nodded. He walked past Elias, straight to the weird, ugly wall of bottles. He reached out, hesitating, expecting the glass to be freezing. He laid his hand on the bottle. "But it's hot," Jeb whispered. "It's hot. Still discharging from yesterday," Elias said, closing the door to keep the warmth in. "Thermal lag," It takes about 8 hours for the heat to travel from the outside of the wall to the inside. Keeps the place warm all night. Jeb turned around, looking at the small pile of wood in the corner. You haven't burned a cord? Half a cord, Elias corrected. We were burning the chairs, Elias. We were burning the damn chairs. Let's break down the engineering that saved Elias's life. Because this isn't magic, it's physics that we have largely forgotten in the age of central heating. Elias had created a primitive tram wall, named after French engineer Félix Tram, who popularized the concept in the 1960s. The principle is timeless, but Elias added a twist that made it super effective: phase change and liquid mass. Here is the math on why this worked. 1. The R value versus thermal mass. Jeb's log cabin had a decent R value insulation value. Logs are roughly R1 per inch. An 8-inch log wall is R8. This slows down heat loss. However, logs have very low thermal mass. They don't store energy. Once the source of heat, the fire, is gone, the logs cool down rapidly to match the outside temperature. 2. The water battery. Elias's wall had a lower R value but massive thermal mass. A 1-liter glass bottle filled with water weighs 1 kilogram. If Elias used 500 bottles for his south wall, that is 500 kilograms, or about 1,100 pounds of water. To raise the temperature of that water from 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit takes roughly 33,000 BTUs of solar energy. 3. The release. At night, as the cabin air cools, that 33,000 BTUs of energy stored in the water must go somewhere. Heat always seeks equilibrium. It radiates into the room. While Jeb's stove was outputting bursts of 40,000 BTUs that were immediately sucked out by drafts, Elias's wall was releasing a steady 2,000 to 3,000 BTUs per hour, every hour, all night long. 4. The charcoal slurry. This was the genius stroke. Clear water absorbs only a fraction of the solar spectrum. By adding charcoal dust, Elias increased the absorptivity alpha of the liquid from roughly 0.6 to nearly 0.95. He turned the water into a perfect black body, ensuring that even on cloudy days, the diffuse UV light was captured and converted to heat. 5. The wax seal. By using beeswax, he allowed for slight expansion. If the water froze, the wax would pop out before the glass shattered. But because of the salt content in the river water and the constant solar gain, the water never froze. The thermal mass protected itself. Spring came late that year. The snow didn't fully melt until May, when the ground finally softened. The sound of hammers returned to Bitter Creek. But this time, it wasn't just Elias working. Jebediah Miller was the first. He tore down his south wall. He didn't have enough bottles, so he traded a heifer to a trader from Bismarck for 2 crates of empty wine bottles. The laughter was gone. It had been replaced by the quiet respect that survival demands. They didn't call it passive solar architecture. It didn't care about what looked proper or what your grandfather did back in Ohio. The frontier asked one question: does it work? Elias Thorne proved that sometimes, the difference between freezing and thriving isn't about how much wood you can chop. It's about looking at a pile of garbage, empty bottles, and burnt wood, and seeing a battery that can tame the winter. Today, we spend thousands of dollars on high-tech insulation and HVAC systems. But sometimes, the most advanced technology is just a little bit of water, a little bit of dust, and the wisdom to use what nature gives you for free. If you want to survive, don't just work harder. Think deeper. I'm the frontier historian. Stay warm and keep your powder dry.